On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, a cool spring breeze drifted through the streets of Manhattan's Upper West Side. The Majestic apartments stood silent and imposing at 115 Central Park West, its terracotta facade catching the last golden rays of sunset. At approximately 10:55 p.m., a single gunshot shattered the quiet elegance of the building's Art Deco lobby. Frank Costello, the most powerful mobster in America, stumbled backward, blood streaming down his face from a bullet wound to his head. The shooter, a heavy-set man in a fedora, had already disappeared into the night. As Costello pressed a handkerchief to his temple, a hotel receipt slipped from his pocket and fluttered to the marble floor. On it, written in neat handwriting, was a number that would expose the entire underworld: $651,284. The Prime Minister of the underworld had been shot in his own palace, but he would survive. The empire, however, would not. But before the penthouse overlooking Central Park, before the politicians who climbed 18 floors to kiss his ring, before the Copacabana and the casinos and the carefully orchestrated machinery of organized crime, there was a boy named Francesco Castiglia. He arrived at Ellis Island on a cold morning in 1895, clutching his mother's hand as they stepped off the SS Alsatia from Calabria, Italy. He was 4 years old. His father, Luigi, had come to America months earlier, finding work as a day laborer in East Harlem. The family settled into a cramped tenement at 108th Street and First Avenue, in a neighborhood the Irish called Guinea Gulch, with contempt dripping from every syllable. The apartment had 2 rooms for 7 people. No heat in winter. Rats in the walls. The toilet was shared with 5 other families in the hallway. Luigi Castiglia earned $11 a week breaking rocks for the city's streets. His hands bled through his gloves, his back bent like an old tree. Young Francesco watched his father return each night too exhausted to speak, collapsing into a chair while his mother served watered-down soup. The streets taught Francesco what his father's broken body had already shown him. Honest work was bondage. The system was rigged. The politicians took bribes. The police took bribes. The landlords gouged the immigrants who couldn't speak English well enough to fight back. But there were other men in the neighborhood, men who wore fine suits and walked with purpose, men whom even the Irish cops treated with deference. These men had money. They had respect. They had power. At age 11, Francesco dropped out of school. At 13, he joined a street gang called the 104th Street Gang, running errands for local criminals, learning the architecture of the underworld. He changed his name to Frank Costello, shedding his Italian identity like a snake sheds skin. It wasn't assimilation. It was camouflage. The Irish ran Tammany Hall, the political machine that controlled New York City like a private fiefdom. An Irish name opened doors. An Italian name got you a nightstick to the skull. By 1915, Frank Costello had been arrested for assault and robbery. By 1918, he'd moved into the more profitable realm of illegal gambling, running dice games and card rooms in the back of Harlem saloons. The work was dangerous, but lucrative. More importantly, it taught him something the street thugs never understood. Violence was expensive. Violence attracted attention. Violence was the tool of the desperate and the stupid. Frank Costello was neither. He studied the system like a scholar studies texts, learning which judges could be bought, which politicians needed campaign contributions, which police captains would look the other way for a monthly envelope. He married Loretta Gigerman in 1918, the sister of a fellow bootlegger. The marriage would last 55 years, though they would never have children. Loretta understood what she was marrying into. She asked no questions. She kept no records. She became a shadow, living in the mansion of silence that mob wives inhabited by necessity. Then came the gift that transformed Frank Costello from a Harlem gambler into an architect of empire. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect. The Volstead Act made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal across the United States. Prohibition, the great American experiment in legislated morality. It was the most profitable law ever passed for organized crime. Within weeks, Costello partnered with the ambitious young gangster named Charlie Luciano and a calculating Jewish mobster named Meyer Lansky. Together, they formed a liquor importation operation that would gross millions. Costello's role was unique. While Luciano handled the muscle and Lansky managed the money, Costello cultivated the politicians. He became the bridge between the underworld and the legitimate world, the translator who spoke both languages fluently. He hosted dinners for judges. He contributed to congressional campaigns. He golfed with police commissioners. He never raised his voice. He never made threats. He simply made himself indispensable. The money poured in like floodwater. Costello invested in legitimate businesses, slot machine operations, real estate. By 1928, he controlled thousands of slot machines across New York, placing them in candy stores, barber shops, and social clubs. The machines were manufactured by the Mills Novelty Company and shipped in crates marked arcade equipment. Each machine generated approximately $50 a day in revenue. Costello owned an estimated 10,000 of them. Do the math. $500,000 per day. In 1928, money. He laundered the profits through a network of shell corporations and legitimate businesses. He purchased a sprawling estate in Sands Point, Long Island, a gilded enclave where the Guggenheims and Chryslers built their summer palaces. But that wasn't enough. Costello wanted something more. He wanted a throne in the center of the kingdom. He wanted an address that announced his arrival into a realm where gangsters weren't supposed to tread. He wanted a home that looked across Central Park like a king surveying his domain. In 1929, construction completed on the Majestic Apartments, one of the 4 iconic twin-towered buildings that would define the Central Park West skyline. Designed by the firm of Irwin S. Chanin, the building rose 30 stories into the Manhattan sky. A masterpiece of Art Deco architecture with terracotta ornamentation and setback towers that created a silhouette both elegant and imposing. The building occupied the entire block front between 71st and 72nd Streets. The apartments were enormous, featuring servants' quarters, wood-burning fireplaces, and panoramic views of Central Park. This was not merely housing. This was a statement. Residents included prominent surgeons, successful attorneys, investment bankers. And in 1931, Frank Costello moved into a spacious penthouse on the 18th floor. The Prime Minister had found his palace. The apartment was everything the tenement of his childhood was not. High ceilings with ornate plasterwork, parquet floors of dark walnut, a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Central Park like a living painting. In spring, he watched the trees bloom. In summer, he watched the sailboats drift across the reservoir. In autumn, he watched the leaves turn gold and red. In winter, he watched the snow transform the park into a silent kingdom of white. The apartment had multiple bedrooms, though he and Loretta remained childless. There was a formal dining room where he hosted dinners for judges and union leaders and politicians who arrived after dark and left before dawn. The kitchen was modern and gleaming, though Costello rarely ate at home. The building had a doorman who knew when to remember and when to forget. It had a lobby of Italian marble and bronze fixtures. It had an elevator operator who pressed the button for the 18th floor and stared straight ahead, seeing nothing. Directly across Central Park West stood another iconic building, the Dakota. Built in 1884, it was already legendary, a Gothic fortress where the city's oldest money resided. From his windows, Costello could see the Dakota's distinctive roofline, its gables and dormers and copper finials turned green with age. There was symbolism in that view. The Dakota represented old New York, the aristocracy of inheritance and pedigree. The Majestic represented new New York, where money talked louder than bloodlines, where a Calabrian immigrant could purchase a throne 18 floors above the city that had once spit on him. The two buildings faced each other across the park like opposing monarchs, one legacy fading, the other ascending. Costello understood this. He'd made himself untouchable, not through violence, but through patient cultivation of power. While other gangsters shot their way to the top and died young, Costello built an empire on handshakes and envelopes. The Penthouse became the nerve center of his operations. This was where he met with his most trusted associates, where he received tribute from the captains who controlled territories across the city, where he made decisions that rippled through every gambling den, every union hall, every political clubhouse in New York. But Costello never conducted explicit business inside these walls. He was too smart for that. Conversations were conducted in euphemisms and gestures. Money never changed hands inside the apartment. No records were kept. No names were written down. If federal agents ever obtained a warrant, they would find nothing but an elegantly furnished home occupied by a successful businessman. The real business happened in his head. In the vast mental ledger where he tracked debts and favors, threats and opportunities, the complex mathematics of power. By 1936, the landscape of organized crime had transformed. Charlie Luciano, now the boss of what would become the Genovese crime family, had restructured the mob along corporate lines. Gone were the chaotic gang wars of the 1920s. In their place was the Commission, a board of directors for organized crime, where the heads of the 5 families met to resolve disputes and coordinate operations. Luciano was the chairman. Costello was his most trusted advisor, the man who handled the political connections that kept the entire machinery running. Then, in 1936, crusading prosecutor Thomas Dewey indicted Luciano on charges of compulsory prostitution. It was a dubious case built on the testimony of prostitutes who were coached and coerced. But Dewey needed a scalp to advance his political career, and Luciano was convicted. He received a sentence of 30 to 50 years. The king was deposed. From his cell in Dannemora, the notorious Clinton Correctional Facility known as Little Siberia, Luciano appointed Frank Costello as acting boss. It was an unusual choice. Costello wasn't a street tough. He'd never killed anyone, at least not with his own hands. He didn't inspire fear through physical intimidation. But Luciano understood what others did not. The future of organized crime wasn't in back-alley violence. It was in boardrooms and city halls, in carefully constructed webs of influence that made the mob indispensable to the legitimate world. Costello was the perfect boss for this new era. He took meetings at the Waldorf Astoria. He had lunch with judges at expensive restaurants. He wore tailored suits from the finest haberdashers. He spoke quietly and carried no weapon. The newspapers began calling him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. The title fit. He governed through consensus and influence, not through bloodshed. From his Central Park penthouse, Costello expanded the empire. He diversified the family's operations beyond gambling and bootlegging, which had ended with the repeal of prohibition in 1933. He invested in legitimate businesses, purchasing interests in real estate developments, restaurants, and entertainment venues. In 1940, he became a major investor in the Copacabana, the legendary nightclub at 10 East 60th Street. The Copa became the crown jewel of Manhattan nightlife, where Frank Sinatra crooned, where celebrities and socialites rubbed shoulders with gangsters and politicians. Costello rarely visited. He didn't need to. His investment partners ran the day-to-day operations, but everyone knew who really owned the place. The Copa was more than a business. It was a symbol of how completely the underworld had infiltrated the legitimate world. A mobster owned the venue where America's aristocracy came to play. If you're beginning to see how power really works in America, how the systems we trust are built on foundations of compromise and corruption, leave a comment below with the word "throne" and let me know what you're thinking. During World War II, Costello's position became even more secure. When the luxury liner SS Normandy caught fire and capsized at a Manhattan pier in 1942, naval intelligence suspected sabotage. Desperate to prevent further attacks, they reached out to the mob for help securing the waterfront. Luciano, still in prison, brokered the deal. The mob would guarantee no strikes, no sabotage, no enemy infiltration of the docks. In exchange, Luciano would receive preferential treatment, including a transfer to a less harsh prison. Costello served as the intermediary, coordinating between naval intelligence and the Union bosses who controlled the longshoremen. The arrangement worked flawlessly. Not a single incident of enemy sabotage occurred on New York's docks for the remainder of the war. The government and the mob were partners. The line between legitimate and illegitimate had blurred beyond recognition. In 1946, Luciano's sentence was commuted by Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had prosecuted him a decade earlier. The official reason was Luciano's cooperation during the war. The real reason was more complex, involving political favors and backroom deals that would never be fully documented. But there was a catch. Luciano's sentence was commuted on the condition that he be deported to Italy. On February 9, 1946, he boarded a freighter bound for Rome. He would never set foot in America again. The exile made Costello's position as boss permanent. The acting title was dropped. Frank Costello was now the undisputed head of the Luciano crime family, controlling an empire that stretched from the gambling dens of Harlem to the casino floors of Las Vegas, from the union halls of the waterfront to the political clubs of Tammany Hall. But power breeds envy, and envy breeds betrayal. Within the family, not everyone accepted Costello's leadership. There was a faction that believed the boss should be a street tough, a man who'd killed with his own hands, not a political fixer who'd never fired a gun in anger. The leader of this faction was Vito Genovese, a brutal enforcer who'd fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid a murder charge. During the war, Genovese had ingratiated himself with the invading American forces, serving as an interpreter and black market operator. He'd murdered a rival mobster in Italy and gotten away with it. When he returned to New York in 1945, the murder charge waiting for him mysteriously collapsed after a key witness died of poisoning. Genovese was ambitious, he was ruthless, and he believed the family belonged to him. The tension between Costello and Genovese became the defining conflict within the organization, a Cold War fought through intermediaries and proxies. Costello's strength was his political connections, and in the late 1940s, those connections faced serious challenges. The Kefauver Committee, a Senate subcommittee investigating organized crime, began holding televised hearings in 1950. America watched in fascination as mobsters and corrupt officials paraded before the cameras. On March 13, 1951, Frank Costello was called to testify. He appeared in a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair immaculately groomed. His lawyer objected to his face being shown on television, so the cameras focused on his hands. For hours, America watched Costello's hands, the fingers drumming nervously on the table, the hands clasping and unclasping. The physical manifestation of tension beneath his calm exterior. He invoked the Fifth Amendment repeatedly, refusing to answer questions about his business interests, his income, his associates. But the damage was done. The Prime Minister had been exposed. His photograph appeared in every newspaper. His name became synonymous with organized crime. The heat became unbearable. Federal agents investigated his taxes. Immigration officials tried to revoke his citizenship and deport him. Police departments that had once looked the other way now raided his gambling operations to prove they weren't corrupt. The political protection that Costello had so carefully cultivated began to erode as politicians distanced themselves from the now infamous mobster. His income plummeted. The slot machine operations were shut down. The gambling dens were raided. The Kefauver hearings had accomplished what decades of law enforcement couldn't. They'd made Frank Costello toxic, but he still controlled the family. He still had loyal soldiers. He still lived in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, still met with his associates, still made the decisions that mattered. The empire was wounded but not defeated. Then, in 1957, everything changed. Vito Genovese had spent years building his power base within the family, recruiting younger members who shared his contempt for Costello's political approach. Genovese wanted a return to the old ways, to the days when respect was earned through fear and violence, not through envelopes delivered to politicians. He began systematically undermining Costello, spreading rumors that the boss was weak, that the federal pressure had broken him, that it was time for new leadership. The other families watched with interest. Some supported Costello. Some remained neutral. None intervened. This was an internal matter, to be resolved by the Luciano family itself, or rather, what everyone was now beginning to call the Genovese family. The name change itself was an act of disrespect, an assertion that Genovese was the rightful heir, not Costello. On the evening of May 6, 1957, Frank Costello had dinner at L'Aiglon, an upscale French restaurant on East 55th Street. He dined with friends, discussing nothing of consequence, just men of a certain age sharing a meal. The restaurant was elegant and discreet, the kind of establishment where celebrities and power brokers could eat without being disturbed. Costello left around 10:30 p.m., his driver waiting outside in a Cadillac. They drove north through Manhattan, up the west side, pulling up to the Majestic apartments at approximately 10:55 p.m. Costello exited the car and walked into the lobby. The doorman nodded. The elevator operator prepared the car. It was a routine Costello had performed thousands of times. He moved through the marble lobby toward the elevator, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet space. He didn't notice the heavy-set man in the fedora waiting near the entrance. He didn't see the man's hand slide into his coat pocket. He was thinking about tomorrow's meetings, about the problems that needed solving, about the empire that required constant attention. The man in the fedora called out, "This is for you, Frank." Costello turned toward the voice. The man fired. A single shot from a .38 caliber revolver. At that range, it should have been fatal. The bullet should have entered Costello's skull and ended the Prime Minister's reign in an instant. But the shooter, Vincent the Chin Gigante, made a critical error. He called out before firing, giving Costello a split second to react. As Costello turned, he instinctively moved his head. The bullet, aimed for his brain, grazed his scalp instead, cutting a furrow through his skin and exiting behind his right ear. Blood poured down Costello's face. He stumbled backward, pressing his hand to his head. Gigante, certain his target was dead, fled through the lobby doors and disappeared into the Manhattan night. The doorman rushed to Costello's side. Someone called for an ambulance, and as Costello collapsed into a leather chair in the lobby, a hotel receipt slipped from his pocket and fell to the marble floor. The police arrived within minutes. An ambulance transported Costello to Roosevelt Hospital, where doctors determined the wound was superficial. The bullet had cut his scalp, but hadn't penetrated the skull. He'd been impossibly lucky. A fraction of an inch to the left, and the Prime Minister would have died in the lobby of his own building. As he lay in the hospital bed, detectives questioned him about the shooting. Costello, adhering to the code that had governed his entire life, gave them nothing. "I don't know who shot me," he said. He claimed he hadn't seen the shooter's face, hadn't recognized the voice, had no idea who might want him dead. It was a transparent lie. Everyone knew who was behind the hit. Vito Genovese had ordered the assassination. Vincent Gigante had pulled the trigger, but Costello would never testify. That wasn't how this world worked. The hotel receipt found in Costello's pocket proved far more damaging than the bullet. It was from the Tropicana Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, dated April 27, 1957. Written on it in clear handwriting was a number, $651,284. Federal investigators immediately recognized its significance. The Tropicana had opened just weeks earlier. This receipt represented Costello's share of the casino's profits for a single period, likely a week or two. It was proof of casino skimming, the practice of taking money off the top before it was reported for tax purposes. The mob had invested in Las Vegas casinos through frontmen, controlling operations while remaining hidden in the background. The skimmed money was divided among the partners and never reported as income. The Tropicana receipt exposed the entire operation. Within months, federal investigators descended on Las Vegas, auditing casinos, investigating ownership structures, building tax evasion cases against mob figures across the country. Costello recovered from his wounds within days. The bullet had been meant to kill him, but his skull bore only a scar, a reminder of how close death had come. He returned to his penthouse at the Majestic, climbing those 18 floors for what everyone knew would be the beginning of the end. The assassination attempt had shattered the illusion of his invincibility. Younger members of the family now whispered openly that Costello's time had passed. Vito Genovese, though Gigante had failed to kill Costello, had succeeded in making a statement. The old regime was finished. The political fixer with his judges and politicians couldn't protect himself from a bullet. Power, as it always had, still flowed from the barrel of a gun. The federal investigation spawned by that hotel receipt only accelerated the inevitable. Costello faced tax evasion charges that could send him to prison for years. His political connections, already frayed by the Kefauver hearings, couldn't save him from the evidence found in his own pocket. On May 10, 1957, just 8 days after the shooting, Costello met with Genovese in a carefully arranged sit-down. The location was neutral territory, a social club in Brooklyn where neither man had absolute control. Other family members attended, serving as witnesses to what amounted to a negotiated surrender. Costello, his head still bandaged, announced his retirement. He was 66 years old. He'd led the family for 11 years, served as acting boss for another decade before that. He'd transformed organized crime from a collection of street gangs into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching into every aspect of American life. But he was also realistic. The assassination attempt had failed, but there would be others. Gigante might have botched the hit, but the next shooter wouldn't. And even if he survived the internal threat, the federal government was building an airtight tax case against him. He was finished. Genovese became the official boss. The Luciano crime family formally became the Genovese crime family. And Frank Costello, the prime minister of the Underworld, became a ghost. The terms of his retirement were surprisingly generous. Costello would keep his legitimate business interests. He would receive a pension from the family, regular payments that ensured his financial security. In exchange, he would step away completely from criminal operations. No gambling, no loan sharking, no involvement in family decisions. He would be respected as an elder statesman, but wielded no power. Most importantly, he would never testify against anyone. His silence was the price of his peaceful retirement. Costello accepted these terms without argument. He understood the mathematics of survival. Some bosses, when deposed, fought back and ended up in the trunk of a car. Others went quietly and lived to old age. Costello chose old age. He'd spent 40 years in the underworld without ever being convicted of a major crime, a testament to his intelligence and caution. He wasn't going to throw that away in a futile attempt to hold on to power. The game was over. He'd lost, but he'd survived. In the world he inhabited, that was its own kind of victory. The penthouse at the Majestic remained his primary residence, though he spent increasing amounts of time at his estate in Sands Point, Long Island. The Sands Point house was a sprawling property with manicured lawns and gardens overlooking the Long Island Sound. It was here that Costello discovered an unexpected passion. He began cultivating orchids. The man who'd once controlled the flow of illegal money through New York City now spent his days in a greenhouse, tending to delicate flowers that required precise temperatures, carefully calibrated watering schedules, and infinite patience. The orchids became his obsession. He studied their genetics, their growing patterns, their vulnerabilities to disease. He corresponded with botanists and entered his flowers in competitions. His orchid collection became renowned among serious collectors, a strange footnote to a career built on gambling and political corruption. There was something almost poetic in the transformation. The man who'd thrived in the shadows now cultivated things that required light. But the federal government wasn't finished with him. The receipt from the Tropicana had given prosecutors the evidence they needed. In 1958, Costello was convicted of tax evasion related to unreported income from Las Vegas casino operations. The trial was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. At 67 years old, he entered the federal penitentiary in Atlanta to begin serving his sentence. Loretta remained at the penthouse, waiting. She'd married a young bootlegger 40 years earlier and had lived through his rise to the summit of organized crime. Now she waited while he served time for a receipt he'd been careless enough to carry in his pocket. The life of a mob wife was one of waiting. Waiting for phone calls, waiting for indictments, waiting for the bullet that might come through the door at any moment. She'd accepted that life decades ago. She continued accepting it now. Costello served 3 years of his sentence before being released on parole in 1961. He was 70 years old, a thin, silver-haired man who looked more like a retired banker than a legendary crime boss. He returned to the Majestic, to the penthouse with its views of Central Park, and resumed his life as a retired gentleman. He had breakfast at local diners. He took walks through the park he'd gazed upon for decades. He visited his doctors, maintaining his health with the same careful attention he'd once applied to political relationships. He read the newspapers, watching the world change. The mob families were under siege. Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General under his brother's administration, had declared war on organized crime. Wiretaps, surveillance, aggressive prosecutions. The comfortable arrangement between the underworld and the authorities that Costello had helped construct was collapsing. Vito Genovese, the man who'd orchestrated Costello's downfall, didn't enjoy his triumph for long. In 1959, Genovese was convicted on narcotics conspiracy charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He would die behind bars in 1969, killed not by a bullet, but by a heart attack while serving his sentence. The circumstances of his conviction were suspicious. Many believed that other mob bosses, tired of Genovese's brutal and reckless leadership, had fed information to federal authorities to ensure his imprisonment. Carlo Gambino, the quiet boss of the Gambino crime family, emerged as the most powerful figure in the New York underworld, ruling through the same subtle political approach that Costello had pioneered. The old man, exiled to his penthouse, had been proven right. Violence attracted attention. Political power sustained empires. But Costello took no satisfaction in this vindication. He'd moved beyond such concerns. His empire was behind him. His remaining years would be lived quietly. The changes that swept through New York in the 1960s transformed the city around him. The old Tammany Hall political machine that Costello had cultivated collapsed under the weight of corruption investigations. The Irish politicians who'd once accepted his envelopes were replaced by reformers who couldn't be bought, or at least were more expensive to purchase. The neighborhoods where he'd operated changed demographics. The Italian Harlem of his youth became primarily Puerto Rican and African American. The social clubs where he'd held court closed or were raided. The younger generation of mobsters didn't know him except as a legend. The prime minister who'd never been convicted of a major crime, who'd retired wealthy and free, while so many others died violent deaths or rotted in prison cells. To them, he was a ghost from another era, when organized crime operated with a veneer of sophistication. The new mob was more brutal, more directly involved in narcotics, less concerned with political connections. Costello's model was fading, but within his penthouse, time moved slowly. The same furniture remained in place, the same paintings hung on the walls, the same view of Central Park spread before him, seasons cycling through their eternal pattern. Costello lived simply in his retirement. He had money, certainly, from legitimate investments and the pension the family provided. But he didn't flaunt it. He wore simple suits. He ate modest meals. His only indulgence was the orchid collection at Sands Point, and even that was more passion than indulgence. The man who'd once controlled millions in illegal gambling revenue now tracked his expenses in a small notebook, a habit from his poverty-stricken childhood that he'd never abandoned. Money had never been the point. Power had been the point. Respect had been the point. The ability to sit in a room with politicians and judges and be treated as an equal, that had been the point. And he'd achieved all of it, rising from a tenement in East Harlem to a penthouse overlooking the city's most iconic park. Share this story if you believe history's lessons about power and corruption still matter today, especially as we watch similar patterns play out in modern America. Loretta's health began to fail in the late 1960s. She suffered from heart problems, her body weakened by decades of stress and the life she'd lived in the shadows of her husband's empire. Costello tended to her with the same meticulous care he applied to his orchids. He hired nurses. He consulted with the best physicians. He spent hours at her bedside, reading to her, talking about memories from when they were young, and everything seemed possible. But medicine has its limits. On December 17, 1967, Loretta Costello died of heart failure at their Sands Point estate. She was 71 years old. They'd been married for 49 years. The funeral was small and private. A few old friends attended. A handful of distant relatives. No mob figures came. That world had been left behind. Costello buried his wife in a cemetery on Long Island and returned to the Majestic alone. The loneliness that followed Loretta's death settled over Costello like winter fog. He'd spent his entire adult life married to a woman who asked no questions and kept no secrets, who understood that the less she knew, the safer she remained. She'd been his partner in a marriage built on silence and survival. Now the penthouse felt cavernous. The rooms echoed with absence. He spent more time at Sands Point, in the greenhouse with his orchids, finding solace in the routine of cultivation. But he couldn't escape the past. Federal investigators occasionally contacted him, asking questions about old cases, old associates. He answered with the same response he'd given for 50 years. "I don't recall. I don't remember. I have no knowledge of that." The code of silence held even in retirement, even when there was nothing left to protect. It was simply who he was. The Prime Minister who'd governed through discretion maintained that discretion until the end. In 1972, Costello's health began to deteriorate. He suffered from heart disease, his cardiovascular system weakened by age and stress. He moved slowly through the penthouse, this man who'd once walked with such confidence. His doctors prescribed medications, advised dietary changes, recommended he avoid stress. He complied with their instructions with the same discipline that had characterized his criminal career. He took his pills precisely on schedule. He followed his diet religiously. He walked for exercise every morning when weather permitted, circling the paths of Central Park, anonymous among the joggers and dog walkers who had no idea they were sharing the trails with a legend. Some mornings he would pause at the wall overlooking Central Park West and look up at the Majestic, finding his windows on the 18th floor, observing his own apartment from the outside as if seeing his life from a distance. But the heart is a muscle, and eventually all muscles fail. On the morning of February 18, 1973, Frank Costello woke in his penthouse feeling unusually tired. He went through his normal routine, breakfast prepared by his housekeeper, the morning newspapers spread across the dining room table. He read about Watergate, about President Nixon and the gathering storm of scandal. He read about the stock market, about interest rates and inflation. He finished his coffee and stood to walk to his favorite chair by the windows. Halfway across the living room, pain exploded in his chest. A massive heart attack, sudden and catastrophic. He collapsed to the parquet floor, the same floor he'd walked thousands of times. His housekeeper heard the fall and rushed into the room. She called for an ambulance, but there was nothing to be done. Francesco Castiglia, who'd become Frank Costello, who'd become the Prime Minister of the Underworld, died on the floor of his Central Park penthouse at 10:47 a.m. He was 82 years old. The funeral was held at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel on Madison Avenue, the same funeral home that had hosted services for Rudolph Valentino, Judy Garland, and countless other celebrities and society figures. It was Frank Costello's final statement, to be mourned in the same venue as Hollywood stars and socialites, confirming what he'd spent his life proving, that he belonged in their world, that he'd transcended his origins in the tenements of East Harlem. Approximately 100 people attended, a modest number for someone who'd once wielded such power. There were distant relatives. There were a few old friends from the neighborhood. Notably absent were mob figures. The families stayed away, maintaining the fiction that they'd never known him, that he'd been merely a legitimate businessman. The service was simple and brief. A priest delivered generic prayers. No eulogies were given. No one stood to share memories or anecdotes. Frank Costello, who'd spent his life avoiding attention, was buried with the same discretion. His body was interred at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, next to Loretta, in a plot marked by a simple headstone with his name and dates. His will, probated in the weeks following his death, revealed an estate valued at approximately $1 million, entirely from legitimate investments and real estate. There were no hidden bank accounts stuffed with mob money, no safety deposit boxes filled with cash. If he'd accumulated the vast fortune that legend attributed to him, it was hidden so successfully that even federal investigators never found it. More likely, most of his criminal earnings had been spent maintaining his lifestyle, paying legal fees during his numerous indictments, and supporting the vast network of politicians and officials whose cooperation kept him out of prison for most of his life. What remained was modest by the standards of someone who'd controlled the most powerful crime family in America, but it was enough to confirm the legitimacy of his later years, to support the fiction that he'd merely been a businessman with unfortunate associations. The penthouse at the Majestic was sold by his estate. The new owners were a young couple, both professionals with no knowledge of the apartment's history. They renovated, tearing out the old parquet floors and replacing them with modern materials. They repainted the walls, covering decades of history with neutral tones selected from design magazines. They updated the kitchen and bathrooms, erasing the last physical traces of Frank Costello's presence. The apartment changed hands several more times over the decades. In 2014, it sold for $3.5 million to an investment banker and his wife. They knew the history, had researched the building before purchasing, found references to Costello in old newspaper archives. The history added cachet, a dark glamour that made the apartment more desirable rather than less. They hosted dinner parties where they casually mentioned that a famous mobster once lived in these rooms, that the assassination attempt happened in the lobby below. The guests would murmur with interest, sipping wine while looking out at the same Central Park views Costello had observed for decades. By 2025, the penthouse is valued at over $7 million. The price reflects the Manhattan real estate market's insane appreciation, the desirability of Central Park West addresses, the prestige of pre-war buildings with their high ceilings and solid construction. But the price also reflects something intangible: the history. The knowledge that significant events occurred within these walls, that a man who changed the nature of organized crime in America lived here, governed from here, nearly died because of the receipt he carried here. Real estate agents mention Costello when showing the apartment to prospective buyers. Some buyers are deterred by the association with organized crime. Others are attracted to it. In a city that demolishes its history with alarming regularity, buildings that retain their stories become more valuable. The Majestic endures, its twin towers still defining the Central Park West skyline, still housing the wealthy and successful, still standing as testimony to an era when architecture made statements about permanence and grandeur. The lobby where Vincent, the Chin Gigante, shot Frank Costello remains largely unchanged. The Italian marble floors are the same. The bronze elevator doors are the same. Modern security cameras have been installed, and a doorman still monitors who enters and exits, but the fundamental character of the space persists. Residents walk across that lobby daily, most unaware that blood once pooled on these floors, that one of the most brazen assassination attempts in mob history occurred here. The building management doesn't advertise the history. There's no plaque commemorating the event. The Majestic simply continues, housing its residents with the discretion and luxury that originally attracted Frank Costello to purchase his penthouse here 84 years ago. The building has outlasted the man, outlasted the empire he built, outlasted the very social structures that made his rise possible. If you found this story compelling, hit the like button, because your engagement helps uncover more of these forgotten American chronicles that connect our past to the systems we live in today. Vincent the Chin. Gigante, the man who pulled the trigger that night in 1957, followed a trajectory both bizarre and predictable. He became one of the most powerful mob bosses in New York, eventually taking control of the Genovese family in the 1980s. But Gigante cultivated a reputation for insanity, wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, mumbling to himself, creating a public persona of mental illness designed to avoid prosecution. For years, federal authorities struggled to bring charges against a man who appeared to be incompetent to stand trial. The ruse eventually failed. In 1997, Gigante was convicted of racketeering and murder conspiracy and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He died in prison in 2005, at age 77, killed by the same thing that killed Costello, a heart attack. The two men, shooter and target, both outlived most of their generation of mobsters. Both died of natural causes rather than bullets. It was almost a vindication of Costello's philosophy. The men who relied on violence ultimately faced the same mortality as everyone else. The Genovese crime family continues to exist, operating in the shadows of New York's economy. But it bears little resemblance to the organization Costello led. The political connections that were once the family's greatest strength have been severed by aggressive prosecution and decades of law enforcement pressure. The sophisticated criminal enterprise that Costello built has devolved into a more traditional mafia structure focused on labor racketeering, loan sharking, and extortion. The younger generation lacks the vision of their predecessors. They lack the political sophistication, the understanding that real power comes not from violence, but from making oneself indispensable to legitimate institutions. In that sense, Frank Costello's model died with him. The era of the political fixer, the mob boss who golfed with police commissioners and hosted judges for dinner, ended in that hospital room after the failed assassination attempt. What remained was a degraded version, street thugs playing at Empire. The Tropicana Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, the source of that fateful receipt, has its own history. It opened on April 3, 1957, just weeks before the receipt was dated. The casino was indeed mob-controlled in its early years, with Costello and other New York mobsters as hidden investors. The federal investigations triggered by the receipt found in Costello's pocket expanded into a broader examination of mob influence in Las Vegas. Over the following decades, law enforcement and gaming regulators gradually forced organized crime out of direct casino ownership. By the 1980s, corporate entities had replaced mob front men, and Las Vegas transformed from a mob playground into a legitimate entertainment destination. The Tropicana continued operating until 2024, when it was finally demolished to make room for a new development. The building where those skimmed profits originated, the receipts that ended Frank Costello's career, was reduced to rubble and dust. Another piece of mob history erased by progress and corporate consolidation. The Copacabana nightclub, Costello's investment that had symbolized the mob's infiltration of legitimate entertainment, closed its original location in 1973, the same year Costello died. It was almost poetic timing, as if the nightclub couldn't survive without the man who'd helped create it. The Copa reopened in various locations over subsequent decades, trading on its legendary name, but never recaptured the glamour of its original incarnation. The era when mobsters and celebrities mingled in velvet-lined rooms, when Frank Sinatra sang for audiences that included both judges and hit men, that era ended. Modern nightclubs lack the mystique, the dangerous allure of venues where legitimate and illegitimate worlds collided. The original Copa building at 10 East 60th Street now houses corporate offices, the memories of champagne and showgirls and carefully orchestrated performances replaced by cubicles and conference rooms. The transformation is complete. The Underworld has been paved over. Sands Point, Long Island, where Costello maintained his estate and cultivated his orchids, remains an enclave of wealth. The properties along the Long Island Sound continue to be among the most expensive in the region, homes to finance executives and corporate leaders. Costello's former estate has changed hands multiple times, each owner renovating and updating, erasing the previous owner's imprint. The greenhouse where Costello spent his final years tending orchids was demolished decades ago, replaced by a modern structure better suited to contemporary tastes. The orchid collection, carefully cultivated over years, was dispersed after his death. Some plants went to collectors who understood their value. Others died from neglect or improper care. None remain. The passion that consumed the final chapter of Costello's life vanished like morning dew, leaving no trace. It's a metaphor for his entire existence. The empire he built, the power he wielded, all of it temporary, all of it vulnerable to time and change. The East Harlem tenement where Francesco Castiglia grew up no longer exists. The building at 108th Street and First Avenue was demolished in the 1960s during urban renewal efforts that destroyed entire neighborhoods in the name of progress. Public housing projects rose in place of the old tenements, modern buildings that solved some problems while creating others. The Italian neighborhood that Costello knew vanished, replaced by different immigrant groups pursuing their own versions of the American dream. The social structures that produced men like Frank Costello, the combination of desperate poverty and political corruption that made organized crime a rational career choice for ambitious young immigrants, those structures have changed. Poverty persists, certainly. Corruption persists. But the particular ecosystem that allowed the Italian mob to flourish in the early 20th century cannot be replicated. That moment in history, when prohibition created unlimited opportunity and political machines could be purchased wholesale, is gone forever. The legacy Frank Costello left behind is complicated and contradictory. He was a criminal who subverted democratic institutions, who built wealth on gambling and bootlegging, who corrupted politicians and judges. The damage he caused to the social fabric is incalculable. Every crooked judge who fixed a case, every politician who voted as instructed, every gambling addict who lost everything to his slot machines, these were casualties of his empire. He deserves no lionization, no romantic reconsideration. And yet, there's something compelling in his story. The immigrant child who refused to accept the poverty that seemed his destiny. The young man who studied the system and learned to exploit its weaknesses. The gangster who understood that intelligence mattered more than violence, that patience built more durable empires than brutality. He proved that power in America comes not from birthright, but from understanding how the machinery works, from making oneself valuable to those who already have power. Costello's transformation of organized crime from violent street gangs to sophisticated criminal enterprises had lasting effects, both positive and negative. On one hand, his model reduced the bloodshed that characterized earlier mob conflicts. His emphasis on political corruption over violence meant fewer bodies in the streets, fewer civilians caught in crossfire. The commission structure that he helped develop brought order to a chaotic criminal landscape. On the other hand, his integration of organized crime into legitimate institutions made the mob more dangerous and more difficult to combat. When criminals become partners with politicians and police, when the line between legitimate and illegitimate blurs beyond recognition, the entire system becomes corrupted. Costello's legacy is the normalization of this corruption, the acceptance that power operates through hidden channels, that what appears legitimate often has criminal foundations. This cynicism, this understanding that systems are rigged, that the game is fixed, poisons democratic institutions more effectively than violence ever could. The Central Park that Frank Costello gazed upon from his penthouse windows remains one of New York's greatest treasures. The park that Frederick Law Olmsted designed in the 1850s as a democratic space, accessible to all regardless of wealth or status, has survived decades of neglect and renewal. Today, it's better maintained than at any point in its history, restored through a combination of public funding and private philanthropy. The same paths where Costello walked during his retirement exercise are traversed by millions of visitors annually. The reservoir he watched from his windows has been renamed for Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The meadows and forests, carefully designed to provide an illusion of wilderness in the heart of Manhattan, continue to serve their purpose. The park endures while the men who gazed upon it from their high windows are forgotten. There's a lesson in that. The public good outlasts private ambition. The shared spaces we create together matter more than individual empires. The lesson of Frank Costello's life isn't that crime pays. He spent 3 years in federal prison. He survived an assassination attempt. He lived his final years alone, his wife dead, his empire gone, reduced to tending flowers in a greenhouse. Crime didn't pay in any meaningful sense. What his life demonstrates is the permeability of American institutions, how easily they can be corrupted by men with patience and understanding. Tammany Hall, the political machine that ran New York for generations, fell not because of external pressure, but because men like Costello made it so rotten that it collapsed under its own weight. The mob's infiltration of Las Vegas casinos required cooperation from bankers, lawyers, gaming officials, politicians at multiple levels. These institutions didn't fail because criminals were clever. They failed because legitimate actors chose corruption over duty. That's the real story, not the rise of a clever gangster, but the failure of systems designed to prevent exactly what occurred. Today, the Majestic Apartments stands as it has for 96 years. The Twin Towers still rise into the Manhattan sky, still frame Central Park West with elegance and grandeur. New residents move in, unaware or unconcerned about the building's history. The doorman greets them. The elevator carries them to their floors. They look out their windows at Central Park and see whatever they want to see: nature, beauty, escape from the city's intensity. They don't see what Frank Costello saw: a kingdom, an empire spreading before him, proof that the immigrant child from the tenements had conquered the city that once spit on him. That vision died with him. The building remains, but the meaning has changed. Perhaps that's the ultimate fate of all empires. The physical structures outlast the dreams that created them, housing new dreams, new ambitions, new inhabitants who impose their own meanings onto inherited spaces. The Prime Minister is gone now. The empire is gone. The politicians who accepted his envelopes are gone, replaced by new politicians who found new sources of corruption. The gamblers who fed coins into his slot machines are gone, replaced by new gamblers betting on new games. The orchids he cultivated have died, replaced by other flowers in other greenhouses. What remains is the story, the parable of how power really works in America, how immigrants climb from poverty through any means available, how institutions fail when the people running them choose personal gain over public service. What remains is the building, the Majestic, still elegant, still imposing, still hosting the wealthy in its carefully maintained apartments. And what remains is Central Park, the democratic space that Costello viewed from his anti-democratic perch, the public good that outlasted the private criminal empire. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't just about the past. It's about recognizing patterns that repeat, understanding how power concentrates, seeing the connections between yesterday's corruption and today's institutions. Comment below with the words, "Power and Memory." If this story changed how you think about American history and the buildings that witness it, and share this with someone who needs to understand that the stories we tell about the past shape the future we're building. Frank Costello believed he could buy his way into legitimacy, that money and political connections could transform a Calabrian immigrant into an American aristocrat. He was both right and wrong. He achieved wealth beyond imagination. He lived in one of Manhattan's most prestigious buildings. He hobnobbed with judges and politicians, but he never achieved legitimacy. His name, mentioned today, is synonymous with organized crime, with corruption, with the dark underside of the American dream. The penthouse overlooking Central Park didn't transform him into something he wasn't. It simply provided an elegant stage for the final act of a life lived in shadows. And when that life ended on the parquet floor of his living room, the city he'd helped corrupt barely noticed. A few obituaries mentioned his passing. 100 people attended his funeral. Then he was forgotten. Just another ghost in a city crowded with ghosts. Just another story in the infinite narrative of New York. The real survivors of Frank Costello's story are the institutions he corrupted and the city that outlasted him. New York has absorbed countless criminals, countless corrupt politicians, countless schemes and scams, and exercises in greed. The city digests them all and continues, larger and more complex than any individual can comprehend. The mob families that once seemed so powerful now operate in the shadows, diminished and degraded. The political machines have been replaced by new forms of influence peddling and corruption. The gambling empires have been legalized and corporatized. Everything changes. Everything continues. The cycle of ambition and corruption, of poverty and desperation, of dreams and compromise, this cycle repeats endlessly in this city of 8 million stories. Frank Costello's story is one among millions. Neither the worst nor the best, simply representative of a particular time and place when the rules were fluid, and the ambitious could rewrite their destinies through intelligence and ruthlessness. At 115 Central Park West, the lights still glow in the windows of the Majestic. Residents return home from their jobs and their meetings and their entertainments. They ride the elevator to their floors. They enter their apartments and close their doors against the city's noise. They live their lives, pursuing their own versions of success and happiness. On the 18th floor, in the penthouse that once belonged to the Prime Minister of the Underworld, someone looks out the window at Central Park. The trees are bare now, winter having claimed their leaves. The reservoir reflects the city lights like a mirror. The paths wind through shadows. And the view, the same view Frank Costello gazed upon for decades, remains unchanged. The city below continues its eternal motion, indifferent to the ghosts of the past, focused only on the urgent present and the imagined future. This is the final victory, the city's victory over every empire, every individual, every story. The city endures. The rest is history, waiting for those who dare to remember.